Blood was splattered across the metal he refused to drop, his body broken, but his eyes still searching for something, for someone. In the distance, a figure raced against the storm, paws pounding against wet concrete, breath steaming in the cold night air. It wasn't a man who found him first. It was a shadow with sharp instincts and a loyalty that no betrayal could shatter. They thought they buried the truth 7 years ago, thought they could frame the innocent, erase the past, and no one would ever dig it up again. But they didn't counter on a ghost without a badge, a soldier without an army, and a shepherd who remembered everything. In a city rotting from the inside, it would take more than courage to uncover the buried sins. It would take teeth, it would take blood, it would take the last thing they expected, a dog that refused to forget. If you feel the pull of this story already, hit like, subscribe, and tell me, what do you think happened next, and where in the world are you watching from? I'm reading every comment, waiting to hear your theories. The storm had not yet arrived, but the sky was already bruised with swollen clouds, casting the abandoned flea market in a heavy, oppressive light. Daniel Hayes tightened his jacket against the cutting wind as he meandered between the rows of rusting knickknacks and forgotten memories. His dog Rex, a German shepherd whose muzzle had long since turned gray, walked silently at his side, his ears flicking at every rustle, every whisper of movement in the stillness. It was supposed to be a casual trip, a mindless Sunday stroll to distract himself from the gnawing emptiness of post-deployment life. Daniel didn't even know why he stopped at the dusty stall crammed with military memorabilia. Perhaps it was the battered U.S. flag folded neatly behind a cracked glass frame. Or perhaps it was fate. His eyes drifted over medals, old dog tags, and faded photographs until his fingers brushed against something that felt wrong. A tarnished, heavy metal, half buried beneath a pile of broken badges, glinted dully under the weak light. It was nothing special at first glance, a service medal from a unit Daniel didn't recognize. Yet when he picked it up, a chill ran down his spine, so visceral that Rex let out a low, warning growl. Daniel turned the medal over. There, almost invisible against the scratched back, was an engraving, tiny numbers etched with frantic, almost desperate hands. 4,392,217. He frowned, heart kicking against his ribs. It wasn't standard issue. No soldier would bother engraving something like that. A serial number? A hidden message? Before he could puzzle it out, Rex lunged forward, yanking at the leash. The shepherd, normally steady and unflappable, barked fiercely at the metal, his body stiff, tail raised in high alert. Passers-by turned to stare, but Daniel barely noticed. His focus sharpened, instinct from years of policing snapping awake. Something was wrong. Very wrong. "Easy, boy," he murmured, kneeling down, but Rex didn't settle. His paws scratched at Daniel's jacket pocket where the metal now lay hidden, his bark dropping into a low, insistent whine, the sound he used in war zones when he'd sniffed out explosives or bodies. "What the hell, Rex?" Daniel whispered. The dog's behavior was unmistakable. Not fear, not aggression detection. Daniel straightened up, suddenly aware of the dozens of shadowed faces around him, the cameras disguised as bystanders' phones, the strange coldness creeping up his neck. He clutched the metal tighter, feeling the invisible net tightening around him. Without another glance, he tugged Rexel's leash and pushed through the thinning crowd, not daring to look back. They made it back to his truck without incident, but as Daniel sat behind the wheel, Rex panting nervously beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that the moment he picked up that metal, he'd crossed some invisible line. He pulled out his phone, typing the numbers into a search engine. The results came almost instantly and made his stomach knot. 4,392,217 was a case file, a closed homicide investigation from 7 years ago. Officer Mark Bellamy, accused of murdering a confidential informant. Found guilty, sentenced to life. The summary was brief, sanitized, but Daniel remembered the case. Bellamy had been one of the department's golden boys. Decorated, honorable. His trial had been a media circus, an orgy of betrayal headlines and photo ops. Daniel had always suspected something was off about it, but like everyone else, he'd swallowed the official story. Now, staring at the screen, with Rex still whining under his breath, he knew he couldn't ignore the knot twisting his gut. He stared at the metal again, this time noticing a faint, dried stain near the edge. something brownish-red, almost black. Blood? His pulse thundered in his ears. He needed to think, needed to figure out what this meant, and whether he was already too deep to back out. Rex nudged his elbow, breaking his paralysis. "All right, partner," Daniel muttered grimly. "Let's find out what kind of mess we've stepped into." As he drove away, he failed to notice the black SUV 2 blocks down, idling with its lights off. A man inside snapping photos through a telephone lens. Somewhere in the gathering dusk, the first drops of rain began to fall. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel as the rain thickened, blurring the windshield into a watery canvas of distorted lights. Rex sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his gaze never leaving the console where the metal lay wrapped in an old handkerchief, the faint stain hidden from view yet burning like a brand in Daniel's mind. He parked 2 blocks away from his apartment, instinctively avoiding the direct route, a habit drilled into him from years on the force. As he entered his small, dimly lit living room, he locked the door behind him, double-checking it without thinking before drawing the blinds shut. Only when the world was shut out did he finally sit at the battered oak table, pulling the metal free with trembling fingers. Rex sat nearby, alert, ears flicking back at every creak of the old building. Daniel leaned closer under the harsh yellow light, his breath fogging slightly as he studied the back of the metal again. He squinted, heart pounding, as he noticed something he hadn't before, a fine scratch along the rim, almost like a deliberate marking rather than the random scars of age. Grabbing a magnifying glass from his desk, he angled it carefully, and there it was, etched so faintly it was nearly invisible unless viewed from the right angle. Another set of numbers, smaller, more desperate, almost carved into the metal itself, like a dying man's last attempt to speak. It wasn't just the 4,392,217 he had seen before. There was an extra sequence barely noticeable, an abbreviated timestamp perhaps, or a date and time. The night the murder had occurred, the same night Bellamy had been arrested. A sick, cold certainty coiled in Daniel's gut. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone had wanted the truth buried with the evidence no one bothered to look for. Rex let out a low growl barely audible, snapping Daniel's focus back. He grabbed his laptop, ignoring the sluggish connection as he dove deeper into the database. It took several attempts, restricted files, encrypted archives, but Daniel wasn't the type to give up. When the page finally loaded, his throat tightened. The case file labeled 4,392,217 was as skeletal as he remembered. Basic summary, court dates, an official photo of Mark Bellamy, the former detective staring hollow-eyed at the camera, and the damning evidence listed with sterile precision. But something new caught Daniel's eye now, something he hadn't noticed before, buried deep within the metadata of the case summary. An internal note, dated 2 months after the trial, marked sealed pending further investigation. But there had never been a follow-up. No reopened case, no appeals granted, no news coverage. It was as if the investigation simply evaporated after the conviction. Daniel leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him, mind racing. Who had written that note? Why was it hidden from the public file? And most importantly, what had they found or buried? He rubbed his face with shaking hands. The metal, the extra numbers, the internal note, it all pointed to one horrifying possibility. Bellamy had been framed. His thoughts were interrupted by the shrill buzz of his phone vibrating against the table. Unknown number. Daniel hesitated only a second before answering, heart in his throat. "Hayes," he said, voice clipped. The line went dead. Rex jumped to his feet, muscles tense, hackles raised. Daniel shot to his feet as well, reaching instinctively for the gun he kept tucked behind the kitchen counter. He moved swiftly to the window, peeking through the blinds. Nothing but empty, rain-slick streets. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the shadows, someone was watching. He turned back to the metal, now lying cold and inert under the stark kitchen light, and made a decision. He had to dig deeper. Mark Bellamy had a sister, if he remembered correctly, a public defender who fought tooth and nail to prove his innocence, until she suddenly vanished from the public eye after the trial ended. Maybe she knew something. Maybe she had pieces Daniel was missing. He began digging again, tracing old court records, archived articles, bar association listings. It took hours, but finally he found her. Ellen Bellamy. Last listed address 2 counties over, near an old industrial town that had been in decline for years. No phone number, no social media presence. Daniel stared at the address, rain tapping urgently against the windows, and knew what he had to do. He packed quickly, tossing essentials into a weathered duffel bag, slipping the metal into a padded evidence pouch he'd kept from his days on the force. Rex watched him intently, understanding the shift in energy, tail rigid with anticipation. Before leaving, Daniel scanned the metal one last time under the magnifying glass, almost out of compulsion. That's when he noticed something else. The blood stain he had seen earlier, he thought it was just dried blood, but under close inspection there was something else embedded in the crusted residue. A single human hair, blonde, microscopic but still intact, clinging stubbornly to the tiny groove in the metal's frame. DNA evidence, undisturbed, untested, potentially the key to proving Bellamy's innocence. Daniel's chest tightened with a mixture of dread and exhilaration. If he could get that hair tested independently, it might be the breakthrough no one expected, or the final nail in his own coffin if whoever buried this evidence realized he had it. He slipped the metal carefully into a second airtight container, packed it deep within his bag, and clipped Rex's leash to his harness. The dog's body was tense, head high, ready for whatever came next. Daniel hesitated at the door, staring out into the sodden night, feeling the weight of invisible eyes still pressing down on him. He reached up and clicked off the last light in the apartment, plunging the room into darkness. As he stepped out into the storm, the shadows seemed to shift and ripple across the parking lot, a movement so subtle that if he blinked he might have missed it. He didn't blink, nor did he notice, a few floors up in a darkened window, a figure standing perfectly still, watching his every move. The highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of shifting shadows, rain hammering against the windshield in relentless sheets, and Daniel clenched the wheel tighter as the truck's wipers struggled to keep pace. Rex sat rigid on the passenger seat, ears twitching, nose working the air with the restless energy of a soldier sensing an unseen threat. The unease that had begun in the flea market now coiled tighter with every mile, threading itself into Daniel's muscles, fraying the edges of his concentration. He checked the rearview mirror again, heart stuttering, because the same black SUV he had noticed before was still there, ghosting his movements from 2 car lengths back, headlights kept low, almost blending into the storm. Daniel slowed, pretending to fumble with the GPS on his phone, and watched as the SUV also slowed, maintaining distance with practiced precision. His instincts screamed now, no longer whispers but roaring demands for action. He turned sharply at the next exit, leading the SUV off the highway into a maze of narrow industrial backroads, empty warehouses looming like skeletal sentinels in the driving rain. Rex bristled, growls vibrating through his chest, his body a taut wire ready to snap. Daniel swerved into a deserted loading dock and killed the lights, heart hammering so hard he thought it might betray him. He reached under the seat for the Glock he always carried but hadn't touched in months, feeling the cold metal kiss his palm with a familiar, grim comfort. For a moment there was nothing but rain and the metallic ticking of the engine cooling. Then headlights flared, cutting through the storm, and the SUV turned the corner. Slow, deliberate, a predator stalking wounded prey. Daniel's breath hissed between his teeth as he shoved the door open, Rex leaping out alongside him with uncanny silence despite the wet concrete. He pressed himself against the wall, feeling the icy dampness seep through his jacket, and watched as 2 figures emerged from the SUV, moving with a smoothness that spoke of brutal efficiency. Not amateurs, not random thugs. These men were professionals. One carried what looked suspiciously like a suppressed handgun. The other scanned the perimeter with a compact tactical flashlight, its beams slicing through the downpour in quick, practiced arcs. They weren't here to scare him, they were here to end him. Daniel's mind raced, calculating options, escape routes, probabilities. Rex crouched beside him, every muscle vibrating with suppressed energy, waiting for the signal that had been drilled into him long before Daniel had found him. Daniel whispered, "Stay," but he knew the command would only hold as long as he did. He took a slow breath, forcing his pulse to steady, then stepped out into the open, hands raised halfway to show he was unarmed. "You boys lost?" he called over the rain, his voice carrying just enough mockery to bait them. The gunman raised his weapon in reply. No words needed, no mercy offered. Daniel dove sideways as the silenced shot cracked through the night, the bullet punching into the wall where his head had been a split second before. Rex exploded into motion without waiting for another command, a blur of black and tan fury launching across the open ground. The gunman swung toward the movement, but too late. Rex hit him squarely in the chest with the full force of an 80-pound missile, teeth sinking deep into the man's forearm, the suppressed pistol clattering to the ground. The second figure lunged forward, drawing a knife in a flash of steel, but Daniel was already moving, grabbing a rusted metal pipe from the ground and swinging it with every ounce of desperate strength he had. The pipe connected with a sickening crunch against the attacker's ribs, sending him sprawling into a stack of pallets. Rex maintained his hold, growling deep in his throat, shaking the man's arm with savage jerks, designed to incapacitate without killing. Daniel kicked the fallen pistol away, adrenaline a white-hot flood through his veins. The second man scrambled to his feet, face twisted in rage and pain, knife flashing again. Daniel barely sidestepped the first slash, feeling the blade graze his jacket, slicing through fabric and leaving a cold kiss across his rib. He countered with a brutal strike to the man's wrist, knocking the knife loose, then followed with an elbow to the jaw that dropped the attacker to his knees. Breathing hard, Daniel grabbed the man by the collar, slamming him against the wall, the rain pouring down between them like a living curtain. "Who sent you?" he snarled, but the man only smiled a thin, bloody curve and spat a mouthful of blood at Daniel's feet. No fear, no answers, just cold, dead loyalty to whoever was pulling their strings. From the corner of his eye, Daniel saw the first gunman struggling against Rex, blood smearing across the wet concrete, but the shepherd held firm, jaws locked, body braced. Daniel knew they couldn't stay here. Reinforcements would come, and the clock was ticking faster with every heartbeat. He yanked the gunman's wallet from his back pocket, flipped it open, and found nothing but a fake ID and a crisp, folded piece of paper, a photograph. Blurred, grainy, but unmistakable. It was a surveillance shot of Daniel himself, taken earlier that afternoon outside the flea market. Rex at his side, the metal barely visible in his hand. They had been watching him long before tonight. A calculated move, a deliberate trap. Rex finally released the first attacker at Daniel's sharp command, stepping back with blood dripping from his muzzle. But his stance remained defensive, ready to strike again if needed. Daniel stuffed the photo into his jacket, scooped up the fallen pistol, and backed away from the groaning men without another word. He trusted nothing, not the storm, not the silence, not the darkness that pressed in closer with every step. They reached the truck in a dead sprint, Daniel half expecting another bullet to find him in the back. But the night held its breath, letting them go for now. He threw the duffel bag into the back seat, Rex leaping in after him, and gunned the engine to life. Tires screeched on the wet pavement as they tore out of the loading dock, heading not for the highway but deeper into the labyrinth of backroads where even shadows got lost. Daniel's mind raced faster than the truck's engine, piecing together the fraying edges of a puzzle that promised only blood and betrayal. Whoever wanted the metal silenced wasn't going to stop, and now they knew he wouldn't back down. His chest burned with every ragged breath, but he couldn't afford to rest, couldn't afford to trust anyone. Not yet. Not when the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave was the dog at his side and the ghosts closing in from every direction. The rain had softened into a persistent drizzle by the time Daniel pulled into the crumbling parking lot of a gas station clinging to the edge of nowhere. Neon lights flickering weakly against the wet black asphalt. He killed the engine but left the keys dangling, hands still resting on the steering wheel, heart hammering in a rhythm that felt carved into his bones. Rex shifted beside him, restless, alert, nostrils flaring at every movement in the shadows. Daniel wiped a hand across his face, trying to catch his breath, trying to think. They couldn't run forever. They needed a lead, a way to strike back instead of just surviving. His mind flashed again to the blood-smeared metal locked in the glove compartment and the photo folded deep in his jacket, damning proof that someone had been watching him long before he even knew what he was chasing. He needed answers, and fast. He pulled out his burner phone, fingers moving with soldier's efficiency, dialing the only number he dared risk now. a man he hadn't spoken to in 5 years but who owed him a favor steeped in blood and silence. The phone rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Who the hell is this?" Daniel kept his voice low. "It's Hayes. I need to find Leonard Pike, now." A beat of silence on the line, then a short, bitter laugh. "You're digging up ghosts, Hayes. Pike's been living off the grid since the Bellamy trial. Last I heard he was bartending in Carter's Mill, trying not to get himself killed." Daniel hung up without another word, heart thudding harder. Carter's Mill was 30 miles west, a dying mining town forgotten by the map and the law. The perfect place for men with heavy pasts to disappear. If anyone knew the truth about the metal, it would be Leonard Pike, the key witness, who had testified just enough to damn Bellamy, but not enough to satisfy anyone who looked too closely. Daniel pulled back onto the road, pushing the old truck harder than he should have, wheels spitting mist into the night. The storm had left the world slick and treacherous, and every turn felt like balancing on the edge of a knife. Rex remained tense, vibrating with energy, as if he too sensed they were racing against more than just time. Carter's Mill appeared like a bruise in the landscape. Crumbling storefronts boarded up, streetlights flickering weakly, the smell of rust and mildew heavy in the air. Daniel parked 2 blocks away from the bar and approached on foot, the wet gravel crunching under his boots. He pulled his jacket tighter, the weight of the metal and the gun an anchor against the gathering storm inside him. The bar was a squat building of peeling paint and sagging rooflines, a neon open sign buzzing weakly against the glass. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap whiskey, and the desperate tang of forgotten men. Leonard Pike was easy to spot, a stooped figure hunched at the end of the bar, gray hair greasy and matted, fingers trembling around a glass of something amber and poisonous. Daniel crossed the room slowly, Rex at his heel, every eye following them with the dull interest of the damned. He slid onto the stool beside Pike, ordered a coffee just to keep the bartender moving, then leaned in, voice pitched low and lethal. "Leonard Pike," he said, letting the name hang heavy between them. The old man flinched as if struck, his watery eyes darting sideways before settling on Daniel with a mixture of recognition and dread. "You shouldn't be here," Pike rasped, voice hoarse from smoke and fear. "They watch everything." Daniel didn't blink. "I need to know about the metal, the one Bellamy had the night he was arrested." Pike's face drained of what little color remained. His hand trembled so violently the glass slipped from his grasp, shattering against the floor. Conversations around the bar faltered into uneasy silence, but no one intervened. Daniel pressed, "You lied on the stand, you left something out. Tell me what." For a moment Pike sat frozen, his chest heaving, eyes darting toward the grimy windows as if expecting death itself to burst through them. Then, in a voice so low Daniel had to lean closer to hear, Pike whispered, "The metal, it wasn't just his. It was proof that Bellamy had been onto something big. A trafficking ring, cops, judges, people you don't cross." His hands clawed at Daniel's sleeve like a drowning man. "You made me say he planted evidence. They made me swear under oath. But that metal, it was the key." Daniel felt his blood turn to ice, every instinct screaming that they were running out of time. "Who made you?" he demanded. But Pike was already shaking his head, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "Doesn't matter," he croaked. "They'll find you too." Before Daniel could press further, the shriek of tires outside sliced through the night, followed by a thunderous crash. Every head in the bar snapped toward the door. Daniel was already moving, yanking Pike up by the arm, dragging him toward the back exit. Rex barked sharply, sensing the ambush before it even unfolded. They burst out into the alley just in time to see the black sedan barreling toward them, headlights blinding through the rain. Daniel shoved Pike aside and dove after him, the car missing them by inches, smashing into the rusted dumpsters with a horrific crunch of metal and plastic. The driver's door flew open, a shadowed figure emerging with a limp, dragging a weapon up. Daniel fired instinctively, 2 shots cracking through the night, but the figure ducked behind the wreckage, returning fire with short, precise bursts. Rex lunged forward, snapping and growling, providing just enough distraction for Daniel to haul Pike to his feet again and shove him around the corner toward the truck. They stumbled into the cab, doors slamming, Rex barely clearing the closing door. Daniel slammed the truck into gear and peeled out of the parking lot, tires screaming against wet pavement. In the mirror, he saw the sedan lurching after them, one headlight shattered, smoke billowing from the crumpled hood. Pike was hyperventilating in the passenger seat, clutching his chest, words tumbling out between gasps. "It's too late. You don't understand." Then his eyes widened in horror as another black SUV appeared ahead, cutting across the street with surgical precision. Daniel yanked the wheel hard, the truck fishtailing violently. But there was no escaping physics, no outrunning the setup now closing around them like a noose. The world blurred in a chaos of spinning lights and roaring impact as the truck slammed into the side of an abandoned building, airbags exploding in a blinding rush of force. Daniel's vision blurred, ears ringing. He turned to Pike, blood trickling from the old man's temple. But Pike was already slumping forward, lifeless, a single neat hole punched through the windshield in front of him. Assassination disguised as accident. A hit so clean it would vanish into statistics and coroner's reports. Daniel cursed, fighting to stay conscious, reaching blindly for Rex as sirens began to wail in the distance, growing louder, closer, inevitable. The world returned in fragments, muffled sirens tearing at the edges of Daniel's consciousness as the acrid stench of burnt rubber and blood filled his nose. Blinking against the red haze clouding his vision, he forced his broken body to move, adrenaline scraping raw against his battered muscles. Rex whimpered beside him, alive but limping, a gash running along his side where broken glass had sliced deep. Daniel ignored the searing pain in his ribs and reached out, pulling the dog close with what little strength he had left. They had to move. Now, already he could hear the distinct clatter of police radios, the rhythmic stomp of boots approaching with grim inevitability. Not here. Not like this. With a grunt, Daniel shoved the mangled door open, staggering into the rain-slicked alley, one hand clutching the bloodied duffel bag against his chest. He didn't know how he managed to stay upright, didn't know how Rex managed to limp at his side, but the primal instinct to survive overrode everything else. They slipped through a gap in a chain-link fence just as floodlights bathed the wreckage behind them, the crash scene erupting into a frenzy of shouting uniforms and flashing lights. They moved like shadows, bleeding and broken, deeper into the labyrinth of the abandoned district, until the night finally swallowed them whole. Daniel found temporary refuge in a boarded-up warehouse, collapsing behind a stack of rusting barrels, chest heaving, vision swimming. He pressed trembling fingers to Rex's side, relieved to find the bleeding slowing. "Hang on, buddy," he whispered, voice raw with exhaustion, a little longer. He knew they couldn't hide forever. They needed to figure out their next move. Pike was dead, the only link to the truth severed with surgical precision, and now Daniel was alone in the dark, with nothing but a blood-stained metal and a dog who had already given more than anyone ever should. Fumbling through his shattered phone, Daniel logged into the secure server where the case files for 4,392,217 had once been stored. His hands shook with the effort, each keystroke an agony of battered fingers and broken will. The screen flickered, loading, and then nothing. Blank. No records, no notes, no evidence logs, just an error message blinking back at him like a sneer. Access denied. File not found. He tried again, and again. Same result. The panic clawed up his throat. He switched devices, hacked through layers of firewalls he knew from experience. But it was no use. The entire case file had been purged, scrubbed from existence as if it had never been. He sagged against the cold concrete wall, bile rising in his throat. They were erasing the past in real time, cutting away every thread he might have followed. Without evidence, without testimony, without even an official record, Mark Bellamy would remain a convicted killer, and Daniel would become nothing more than another ghost swallowed by the system. Rex nuzzled his arm, whining softly, and Daniel clenched his jaw against the despair threatening to consume him. "No," he rasped, "not yet. Somewhere someone had to remember. Somewhere a piece of the truth had to survive." Pushing through the haze of pain, he devised a desperate plan. The backup archives, a private, off-grid server where old case files were supposedly duplicated before the department went fully digital. A rumor mostly, a whispered myth among beat cops and detectives who didn't trust bureaucracy to protect justice. If it existed, it would be hidden deep in the bowels of the old precinct, the place Bellamy had worked, the place that had turned its back on him. Under the cover of darkness, Daniel and Rex made their way to the precinct, a crumbling relic scheduled for demolition but still holding decades of rot and secrets. Slipping through the broken fence, they moved silently past cracked windows and gutted hallways until they found the old records room buried in the basement. Daniel picked the lock with a piece of twisted wire, the click of the tumblers sounding deafening in the oppressive silence. The room beyond smelled of mildew and dead air, towers of filing cabinets leaning drunkenly against one another like forgotten tombstones. He scanned the room frantically, ignoring the stabbing pain in his side, until he spotted it. An ancient terminal covered in dust, screen cracked but flickering to life with a groan when he powered it up. Daniel dug through the archaic directory, eyes burning, until he found it a file labeled Bellamy Mark Internal Affairs Inquiry. His pulse quickened. Proof, maybe even enough to reopen the case, to drag the truth kicking and screaming into the light. He yanked a flash drive from his pocket, praying the decrepit machine could still recognize it when a loud crash echoed down the hallway. Rex growled low in his throat, footsteps heavy, purposeful. Daniel's blood turned to ice. They had found him. He jammed the flash drive into the port, fingers flying across the keyboard, heart hammering in his ears. 40%, 60, 80, the footsteps grew louder, boots pounding on the cracked linoleum like a war drum. 90, 95, the screen blinked green. Transfer complete. Daniel yanked the drive free and stuffed it into his pocket, just as the door burst open. 3 officers stormed in, guns drawn, eyes gleaming with the cold satisfaction of men who had already decided he was guilty. Daniel Hayes, one of them barked. Get-a-go dining halls where we can see them. Daniel froze, calculating, but the odds were against him. They wouldn't arrest him cleanly. No, they would paint him as a desperate man caught tampering with evidence. Drop the weapon, another officer shouted, even though Daniel held nothing but the dog's leash. You're under arrest for breaking and entering, obstruction of justice, and assault. He hadn't laid a hand on anyone tonight, but he realized then, with a sick twist of his gut, that it didn't matter. The narrative had already been written. He was the rogue ex-cop gone bad, the cautionary tale, the villain of a story no one would bother questioning. Rex snarled as the officers advanced, his body poised to defend. Daniel whispered, "No, buddy, stand down." He raised his hand slowly, fingers splayed, but the cold muzzle of a gun slammed against the side of his head anyway, driving him to his knees, the world tilting wildly. As the cuffs bit into his wrists, and he was dragged to his feet, Daniel caught a glimpse of the computer terminal through blurred vision. The screen had gone dark, wiped clean, like it had never existed, just like him. The squad car smelled of stale coffee and defeat as Daniel sat cuffed in the back seat, his cheek pressed against the cold plexiglass divider, his wrists aching from the tight metal biting into his skin. Rain hammered the roof in a steady, punishing rhythm, masking the low growl that began vibrating in Rex's chest from where he was leashed behind another officer's cruiser. Daniel turned his head slowly, catching his partner's eyes through the window, and in that glance something unspoken passed between them, a bond that refused to be broken even now. The officers in the front seats spoke in clipped, triumphant tones, discussing paperwork, jurisdiction, the swift end of another rogue cop's tragic spiral. But Daniel tuned them out, focusing instead on the faint scratching noise coming from Rex's vehicle. It started as a whimper, then built into an insistent scratching against the car door, claws scraping with a desperate rhythm that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand on end. He frowned, watching intently as Rex shifted, barked once, then stared directly at Daniel as if trying to will him to understand something urgent. The officer driving glanced back in annoyance, muttered something about damn ghosts. Daniel closed his eyes, reaching back through memory and instinct, piecing together the signals Rex had learned to give over years of joint patrols and missions. When Rex barked like that, short, sharp, chesty, it wasn't random agitation. It was direction. It was a location, it was a target. Daniel tensed, heart beginning to race again, pulse pounding against the bruises blossoming across his skin. Wherever they were headed wasn't where they needed to go. Rex was trying to pull them off course, trying to guide Daniel elsewhere. Somewhere important, somewhere tied to everything they had been fighting for. He forced his breathing to slow, to steady, even as the cruiser made a hard right turn onto a deserted road leading out of town. In the distance, a cluster of blackened trees loomed against the lightning-streaked sky, and nestled among them, a rusted iron gate swung drunkenly in the wind. A cemetery, forgotten, crumbling, lost to time. Daniel's gut twisted violently. He remembered now a footnote buried deep in one of Bellamy's early case files, how Bellamy's mother had died during the trial, her heart giving out under the strain of watching her son destroyed by lies. She had been buried in an unmarked grave when the department disowned her son, when the town turned its back. Daniel's mind raced furiously. Why here, why now? Rex barked again, urgent, desperate, and this time even the officers seemed unnerved, exchanging uneasy glances. The driver cursed under his breath. What's with that damn dog? But Daniel knew. He felt it in his bones. There was something here, something waiting for them. Without warning, Rex hurled himself against the door with all his weight, the old hinges shrieking in protest. The leash snapped, the car lurched, and in the chaos Daniel seized his chance. Twisting violently, he drove his shoulder into the door, using every ounce of battered strength to force it open. He hit the ground hard, rolling through mud and gravel, lungs burning. But he didn't stop. He sprinted, wrists still cuffed, toward the cemetery gate as Rex barreled after him, a streak of wet fur and raw determination. Shouts erupted behind them, boots pounding, guns being drawn. But the storm swallowed the gate, weaving between rows of toppled headstones. The earth soft and treacherous beneath his feet. Rex stayed close, pushing him, guiding him, until they reached a small, crooked stone barely taller than Daniel's knee. He dropped to the ground, gasping, as Rex began frantically pawing at the base of the grave, mud flying in thick, wet clumps. Daniel dug with him, fingers slipping and bleeding, heart hammering against his ribs. They struck something solid, a metallic clang beneath the dirt. Hands shaking, Daniel scraped away the last layer of soil to reveal a small, rusted box wedged beneath the roots of a twisted oak. He yanked it free just as a flashlight beam swept overhead, illuminating the ground where they knelt. Shots rang out, the bark of a pistol cracking through the night, and Daniel flinched as a bullet chewed into the earth inches from his hand. Gripping the box tightly against his chest, he turned and ran, Rex at his heels, weaving through the maze of graves as the officers closed in. They ducked behind a fallen angel statue, panting, drenched, the metal box cold and heavy in Daniel's arms. He fumbled with the latch, cursing as his bruised fingers slipped once, twice, then finally forced it open. Inside, wrapped carefully in layers of brittle, yellowed cloth, lay a bundle of papers, old, fragile, but unmistakably official. Swallowing hard, Daniel pulled the top sheet free, scanning the faded typewritten words by the erratic beam of a dying flashlight. It was a sworn deposition, dated 2 weeks before Bellamy's trial, signed by a man named Carter Langley, a key witness the prosecution had claimed never existed, a man who had disappeared just before the trial began. The testimony was clear, damning in its simplicity. Bellamy had uncovered evidence of systemic corruption within the police department, implicating high-ranking officials in drug trafficking, witness tampering, and contract killings. Langley had witnessed these dealings firsthand and had agreed to testify before he vanished. The implications crashed over Daniel like a tidal wave. This wasn't just about Bellamy. This was about an entire web of rot that reached deeper than he had ever imagined. And now, holding this fragile relic of truth, he realized the stakes were even higher than he thought. A rustling noise snapped his head up. The officers were closing in, their flashlights bobbing through the mist, their voices low and urgent. Daniel shoved the documents back into the box, cradling it against his chest, blood from his split knuckles smearing across the ancient paper. He had to move, had to survive, had to find someone he could trust to get this evidence into the right hands. But in a town built on betrayal, trust was a currency long since spent. Daniel ran like a man possessed, heart battering his ribs, lungs burning with every ragged breath as he clutched the iron box to his chest. Rex sprinting beside him with grim, relentless determination. Behind them, the shouted orders of the pursuing officers grew fainter as the mist and rain swallowed sound and vision alike, turning the ruined cemetery into a maze of shadows and false echoes. Daniel didn't dare stop, didn't dare trust that the distance they gained was enough. Every step forward felt like it ripped him deeper into enemy territory, where every corner could conceal another trap. They burst through a breach in the crumbling cemetery wall and staggered into a gnarled patch of woods, the tangled undergrowth slowing their flight but providing precious cover. Daniel forced himself to think beyond the searing pain lancing through his body, beyond the pounding terror that threatened to cloud his judgment. He needed sanctuary. He needed information. Most of all, he needed to know who was orchestrating this nightmare, pulling strings so deftly that entire pieces of reality were vanishing around him. Hours later, long after the last echoes of pursuit had faded into the storm, Daniel found temporary refuge in an abandoned farmhouse miles outside town. Shoving a broken door closed against the howling wind, he collapsed against the wall, chest heaving. Rex lay nearby, licking at the blood-matted fur on his flank, his brown eyes never leaving Daniel. Moonlight filtered through shattered windows, silvering the dust motes hanging in the air, and casting everything in a dreamlike glow. Daniel opened the iron box again with trembling hands, spreading the fragile papers on the dusty floor. One name kept surfacing among the faded documents, over and over again, like a rot that refused to be buried. Deputy Chief Warren Briggs, the same man who had led the internal investigation into Bellamy, the same man who had testified under oath that the department had conducted a thorough and impartial inquiry. Daniel's gut twisted into a sick knot as he recalled Briggs's smooth, authoritative voice on the witness stand, his polished facade of integrity hiding the casual malice in his cold gray eyes. It had been Briggs all along, orchestrating Bellamy's downfall, sealing away the evidence, silencing witnesses, manipulating the narrative with surgical precision. Daniel rifled through the papers with growing horror. Briggs wasn't just complicit, he was the architect. Langle's sworn deposition detailed meetings between Briggs and known criminal figures, exchanges of cash, confidential files handed over in the dead of night. The corruption wasn't just a stain on the department. It was a cancer that had metastasized into every corner of the justice system. Briggs had built an empire of fear and silence, using the badge not as a shield for the innocent, but as a weapon against them. Rex let out a low growl, snapping Daniel's attention back to the present. Footsteps crunched outside the farmhouse, slow and deliberate. Daniel scooped up the papers and shoved them back into the box, cradling it under one arm as he slipped into the shadows. He crept toward a gap in the boarded-up wall, peering out just in time to see two figures approaching from the tree line, moving with the practiced ease of men who had done this many times before. One carried a heavy flashlight, the other something darker, bulkier, a shotgun. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs. There would be no escape this time. He had to outthink them, outmaneuver them. He darted silently to the back of the house, Rex following like a ghost. They slipped out through a shattered window, boots landing softly in the wet grass. Keeping low, Daniel circled wide, using the thickets for cover, until he was behind the intruders. From this angle, he caught a clearer glimpse of the man with the shotgun and felt his blood run cold. The tattoos snaking up the man's neck were unmistakable. The Black Serpents, an underground syndicate specializing in weapons trafficking, extortion, and contract killings. Bellamy had nearly brought them down before his arrest, working a case so dangerous it had required complete secrecy. But someone on the inside had tipped the Serpents off, someone powerful enough to turn the entire investigation inside out. Someone like Briggs? Daniel's mind raced furiously. Briggs wasn't just covering his tracks out of fear or ambition. He was deeply embedded with the Serpents, protecting their operations in exchange for wealth, power, and control. The implications were staggering. Every case Briggs had touched, every conviction, every deal, tainted and rotten to the core. And if Daniel exposed him, the Serpents would lose their golden shield within law enforcement, the one thing that had made them untouchable. Which meant Briggs wouldn't just come after him with warrants and headlines. He would unleash wolves, men who didn't hesitate, who didn't leave survivors. Daniel's grip tightened on the box as he backed away, weaving deeper into the trees, Rex staying close. He needed a plan, he needed leverage. He needed help, but who could he trust in a town where even the heroes wore masks carved from lies? A sharp whistle cut through the night, and both Serpent enforcers froze, heads snapping toward the sound. Daniel used the distraction to slip further into the darkness, heart hammering, mind already spinning through contingency plans. If he could get the box to a trusted journalist, maybe, just maybe, he could blow this wide open before Briggs closed the noose completely. But time was bleeding away with every heartbeat, every step, every breath, and somewhere behind him, moving like a shadow among shadows, Deputy Chief Briggs was already adjusting his next move, tightening the net that had caught better men than Daniel Hayes. The blow came from behind, sudden and brutal, snapping Daniel's head forward before darkness swallowed the world whole. When consciousness returned, it did so in stuttering flashes of pain and confusion, a bitter metallic taste flooding his mouth as he struggled against the tight cords biting into his wrists. His arms were bound above his head, suspending him from a rusted pipe in the ceiling of what looked like an abandoned warehouse. The air thick with the stench of oil, rust, and something fouler, something that smelled like old fear. Every muscle screamed in protest as Daniel shifted, testing the strength of the ropes, but they were expertly tied, leaving him with no leverage, no slack. The iron box containing the precious documents was gone, so was Rex. Daniel's heart lurched painfully in his chest at the thought of his partner, alone and vulnerable somewhere out there. He bit down on the panic rising in his throat, forcing himself to think, to survive. The warehouse was vast and empty except for a handful of crates stacked haphazardly near the walls, and somewhere beyond his limited field of vision he could hear the faint echo of dripping water, the rhythmic creak of metal straining against the wind. Footsteps approached, deliberate and slow, and a familiar figure emerged from the gloom. Deputy Chief Briggs, immaculate as ever despite the dilapidated surroundings, hands clasped loosely behind his back, a predator savoring the inevitability of his kill. "I warned you, Hayes," Briggs said, his voice smooth and almost pitying. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Daniel didn't bother replying. He met Briggs' gaze with the cold, defiant stare of a man who knew he was already dead, but refused to give his killer the satisfaction of fear. Briggs chuckled softly, circling him like a shark, and Daniel could almost feel the noose tightening with every word. "You think anyone will believe a disgraced ex-cop over me? Over the institution I built?" Briggs sneered. "No, Hayes, you're going to disappear, just like Bellamy, just like all the others." Briggs nodded toward the shadows, and two serpent enforcers stepped forward, brutal-looking men with dead eyes and scarred knuckles. One carried a length of chain, the other a thin garrote glinting under the flickering fluorescent light. Daniel steeled himself, preparing for the worst, when a sudden, piercing bark shattered the oppressive silence. Briggs stiffened, turning sharply toward the noise. Another bark, closer this time, full of rage and urgency. "Rex!" Hope flared hot and wild in Daniel's chest as the warehouse doors exploded inward, the battered frame giving way under the full weight of the charging shepherd. Rex moved like a missile, a blur of fur and torso, and sending him sprawling to the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The second man barely had time to react before Rex was on him too, tearing into his arm with savage precision, forcing him to drop the garrote. Briggs shouted something incoherent, reaching for the pistol at his waist, but Daniel was already moving, swinging his legs up and hooking them around the rusted pipe, using momentum and desperation to snap the weakened metal with a sharp, echoing crack. He hit the ground hard, pain exploding through his battered body, but he didn't hesitate. He rolled onto his knees, lunged for the dropped garrote, and used it to slice through the ropes binding his wrists. Free at last, Daniel surged to his feet, scooping up a fallen pistol and leveling it at Briggs, who froze mid-draw, lips curling into a snarl of pure hatred. "It's over," Daniel rasped, voice low and deadly. "You're done." But Briggs only smiled, cold and unafraid. "You think this ends with me?" he hissed. "You think exposing me will change anything? The serpents are bigger than you can imagine. Bigger than this town." Daniel didn't lower the gun, didn't blink. "Maybe," he said grimly, "but it starts with you." Before Briggs could answer, a shout rang out from the entrance, and a figure emerged from the storm, coat flapping around him, rifle slung across his back. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he recognized the newcomer. John Teller, Bellamy's old partner, long thought dead or disappeared after the scandal. Teller's face was harder, more lined, but his eyes burned with the same fierce light Daniel remembered from old precinct photos. Teller tossed a battered hard drive onto the floor between them, the device skittering across the concrete to land at Daniel's feet. "Everything's on there," Teller said, voice rough with years of hiding. "The original surveillance footage, meetings, payoffs, murders. Bellamy had it all. They just buried it deeper than anyone thought. Briggs went pale, his hand twitching toward his weapon, but Daniel stepped forward, pistol steady. "God," he warned. "It's over." For the first time, Daniel saw real fear flicker in Briggs's eyes. The fear of a man whose fortress of lies was finally crumbling around him. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer, louder. A hurricane of reckoning about to descend. Daniel knelt swiftly, scooping up the hard drive, heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and terror. He had the truth now. He had the key to shatter Briggs's empire. But survival wasn't guaranteed. Not yet. Not with the serpents still out there. Not with death waiting at every corner. The morning broke over the city with a sky the color of old bruises, a fitting backdrop for the storm that was about to rip through its very foundations. Daniel stood outside the courthouse, the hard drive clutched in one hand, the battered iron box in the other. Rex sitting steadfastly at his side, a living reminder that survival sometimes came with teeth and blood. Inside the courthouse, the air was thick with anticipation, the walls vibrating with the whispers of reporters, officers, and onlookers who had caught wind of the rumors swirling like smoke around the reopening of the infamous Bellamy case. Daniel's heart pounded as he stepped through the metal detectors, ignoring the curious glances, the tight-lipped officers who averted their eyes when they recognized him, the ghosts that seemed to cling to every cracked tile and faded seal of justice on the floor. They moved as one down the hallway, Daniel's mind racing through contingency plans, through the fragile chain of evidence now hanging by a thread. Teller had done his part, submitting the original footage from the hidden cameras Bellamy had planted before his arrest. Footage that had somehow survived 7 years of suppression. Footage that no longer left any doubt about the monstrous truth. Daniel clenched his jaw as they entered the courtroom, the sight of Deputy Chief Briggs sitting calmly at the defense table nearly derailing his focus. The older man's smirk a razor across Daniel's nerves. The judge, an imposing figure with steel hair and a reputation for hating corruption cases with a special venom, called the session to order, with a thunderous bang of the gavel. The prosecution wasted no time, moving to admit the new evidence, and the courtroom fell into breathless silence as the lights dimmed and the screen flickered to life. Grainy at first, the footage stabilized to reveal a dimly lit parking garage, a shadowy figure meeting with 2 known serpent operatives, passing them envelopes, photographs, files. The timestamp on the footage matched the night the confidential informant had been murdered, the night Bellamy had been accused of betrayal. Daniel watched Briggs' facade crack slightly, the tightening of his jaw, the twitch of his fingers. But he didn't look away from the screen. He didn't dare. The footage shifted to another angle, this time showing a confrontation between Bellamy and Briggs himself. Words too muffled to hear but body language clear. Bellamy pleading, Briggs cold and immovable. Then the final blow, Briggs drawing a concealed pistol and shooting the informant point blank, planting the gun in Bellamy's stunned hands before slipping away into the darkness. Gasp tore through the courtroom, a visceral, collective recoil as the footage cut out, plunging the room into a stunned silence so complete that even the rain against the windows seemed to hesitate. Daniel barely heard the judge's voice ordering Briggs into custody, barely registered the explosion of reporters scrambling for the doors, because his focus had narrowed to a single, burning point. He reached into the iron box, pulled out the blood-stained metal now carefully sealed in a forensic evidence bag, and stepped forward. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice steady despite the maelstrom inside him. "This metal was recovered during my investigation. Preliminary forensic analysis indicates traces of the victim's blood preserved within the grooves, confirming contact at the scene. Further tests can establish DNA match to the informant murdered the night Bellamy was framed." The judge's eyes sharpened, nodding gravely to the clerk, who took the evidence with gloved hands, sealing the chain of custody with visible care. Briggs, pale now, rose unsteadily from his seat, mouth opening to protest, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Justice, long dormant, stirred with a vengeance. Daniel turned toward the gallery, where rows of officers, former colleagues, and townspeople sat frozen, caught between disbelief and fear. Among them, a figure shifted, a younger officer, sweating profusely, hands trembling as he fumbled with his badge. Rex's head snapped up, nostrils flaring, body going rigid in a way Daniel recognized instantly. Without hesitation, Rex surged forward, barking sharply, his body locked in an alert posture that brooked no misinterpretation. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order," he barked, but Daniel was already moving, intercepting Rex and following his line of sight to the sweating officer. Deputies converged, grabbing the young man as he tried to bolt, dragging him screaming into the aisle. Under pressure, the truth came spilling out: names, dates, details of orders given to falsify reports, intimidate witnesses, bury evidence. He was a pawn, yes, but he had served willingly under Briggs. One more brick in the fortress of corruption that had crushed Bellamy's life and countless others. As the young officer was dragged away, Daniel's knees nearly buckled under the weight of the moment. Rex leaned against his side, solid and warm, the only anchor in a world that had been spinning out of control for far too long. The judge called for a recess, the courtroom erupting into a cacophony of shouts and flashing cameras, but Daniel barely heard it. His eyes locked with Briggs, who sat slumped at the defense table now, the arrogance gone, replaced by something hollow and broken. But Daniel knew better than to believe it was over. Briggs wasn't the only monster lurking in the shadows, and the serpents would not take this humiliation lying down. The weeks that followed unraveled like a dream stitched together by trembling hands, each day pulling another hidden thread of corruption into the merciless light. Daniel sat quietly in the back of the courtroom, the day Mark Bellamy's conviction was officially overturned. A storm of reporters and flashing cameras waiting like vultures outside the heavy oak doors. The old courthouse smelled of varnish and dust, the floorboards creaking with the weight of history. But none of that mattered as the judge's voice echoed through the chamber, firm and resolute. The court finds the defendant, Mark Bellamy, innocent of all charges. Effective immediately, he is to be released from custody. The words crashed over Daniel like a wave, stealing his breath, blurring the edges of the room into something unreal. Rex, seated faithfully at his side, let out a soft, rumbling whine, as if sensing the moment's gravity, as if knowing that 7 years of silence, pain, and injustice had finally cracked open to let in the first fragile rays of freedom. Mark Bellamy, flanked by federal marshals and his new legal team, stepped into the aisle, his movements slow, unsteady, like a man relearning how to exist outside the cage that had devoured nearly a decade of his life. Daniel stood, his hands clenching into fists at the sight of what prison had done to the man who had once been the department's brightest star. Bellamy's frame was gaunt beneath the loose gray suit someone had provided for him, his face hollowed by time and despair, his eyes dulled but not broken. He moved as if carrying an invisible weight, every step an act of defiance against the years that had tried to erase him. Their gazes locked across the courtroom, and for a moment, there was no crowd, no noise, no past, only a shared understanding that some battles, even when won, left scars too deep for the world to see. Outside, the media frenzy erupted like a dam bursting, cameras flashing like lightning, microphones thrust into faces desperate for a quote, a soundbite, a piece of history. Bellamy shielded his face with one trembling hand as he was hustled into a waiting car, and Daniel watched him go, the triumph of the moment curdled by a bitter aftertaste. Justice had been served, but the man they saved was a ghost of the one they had lost. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of a small diner on the outskirts of town, Daniel sat across from Bellamy, 2 steaming mugs of coffee between them, the night pressing against the rain-speared windows. Bellamy's voice was rough, worn thin by years of disuse, but steady as he spoke. "I don't know how to live out here anymore," he said simply, his hands curling into fists against the tabletop. "The world moved on. I stayed behind." Daniel swallowed the lump rising in his throat, feeling Rex's steady weight against his leg, a silent reminder that survival was possible, even after everything. "You don't have to figure it out alone," Daniel said quietly. "None of us should have to." He hesitated, the idea taking shape even as he spoke it, raw and imperfect but burning with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "There are others out there." He met Bellamy's gaze across the table, the flickering neon sign outside painting their faces in shades of blue and red. "I want to find them, help them, clear their names before it's too late." Bellamy's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his tired eyes. A faint, fragile ember of something Daniel hadn't seen before. Hope. A rough chuckle escaped the older man's cracked lip. "You sure you're ready to make that many enemies?" he rasped. Daniel smiled. "A small, fierce thing. Already have," he said simply. And they both laughed, the sound rusty but real. The plan took shape quickly after that, fueled by late-night conversations, battered notebooks, and stolen moments between battles with bureaucracy and the remnants of Bridges' crumbling empire. They found an office space above an old hardware store, the rent cheap, the ceiling leaky, the walls covered in graffiti and old dreams. Daniel worked day and night, filing papers, building networks, reaching out to contacts who still remembered what it meant to serve something bigger than themselves. Bellamy, though frail, poured what strength he had left into research, case reviews, and interviews, driven by a need to salvage what pieces of himself he could from the ruins. And through it all, Rex remained a constant, a silent guardian, a living testament to loyalty and survival. His presence drew people in, broke down walls, turned suspicion into trust. Victims who had once refused to speak opened up when Rex sat beside them, offering nothing but quiet understanding. Daniel couldn't help but marvel at the way the shepherd could still find hope in broken places, still believe in a world worth fighting for. The organization grew faster than either of them expected. They called it Second Light, a name Bellamy had suggested one night when the weight of the past seemed too much to bear. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he had said simply, and Daniel had nodded, the truth of it resonating deep in his bones. They took on cases the courts had abandoned, cases twisted by politics, greed, and fear. They dug through old files, chased forgotten leads, and, when necessary, they fought with everything they had left, refusing to let the truth be buried again. Sometimes they lost, sometimes the system crushed them under its heel, but sometimes, just sometimes, they won. And each victory, each vindicated soul, each shattered life mended, made the struggle worth it. One evening, long after the last light had gone out in the office, and the world outside lay blanketed in stars, Daniel sat on the worn sofa in the back room, Rex's head resting heavily on his lap. He stared at the wall lined with photographs of the men and women they had helped, each frame a silent testament to battles fought and won. Bellamy sat across from him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth as he sipped his coffee, the lines on his face deep but no longer hollow. Daniel leaned back, feeling the quiet satisfaction settle into his bones, the knowledge that though they could never erase the past, they could build something better from its ashes. A new beginning, a new fight, and they were ready. If this story moved you, if it made your heart race or your breath catch, take a moment to like. Your support helps keep these stories alive. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of the story stayed with you the most? Which twist caught you off guard? And while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from. It's always incredible to see how far stories can travel and who they find along the way.